Okay, so in this video, what we're going to look at here is the um, material from John 6, starting in verse 64 through the end of the chapter. And so we'll begin here by, first of all, reading the passage, and then I want to highlight a few key issues. Yet there are some of you who do not believe, for Jesus had known from the beginning which of them did not believe and who would betray him. He went on to say, "This is why I told you that no one can come to me unless the Father has enabled them." From this time, many of his disciples turned back and no longer followed him. "You do not want to leave too, do you?" Jesus asked the 12. Simon Peter answered him, "Lord, to whom shall we go? You have the words of eternal life. We have come to believe and to know that you are the Holy One of God." Then Jesus replied, "Have I not chosen you, the 12? Yet one of you is a devil." He meant Judas, the son of Simon Iscariot, who, though one of the 12, was later to betray him. So, a couple of things here then to point out. First of all, the author of John is presupposing that his readers already know about the calling of the 12, because the calling of the 12 has not been recorded in John's gospel. So this is an indication that this author already can talk about this event and make a reference to calling, even though no calling has actually occurred in his narrative. Jesus knows that one of his followers will not remain faithful. So this seems to have been an important point for all the gospel authors to recognize that Judas' deception was something that was foreknown by Jesus. In other words, Jesus was not duped. Jesus was not tricked. That Jesus knew fine well what would be happening. And we get more of an insight in several of the Gospels that Jesus chooses Judas in order to fulfill a purpose or plan. Someone may have faulted Jesus for having a betrayer in his midst, and so maybe this is part of the reason why it's necessary to have a story that highlights Jesus' knowledge of Judas. So in this gospel, there is a conflict among Jesus' followers, as well as a conflict with Jesus' opponents and his family. So conflict is part of the background of this gospel. This gospel is aware of all kinds of conflicts that are going on. So we get verse 66, and we have this thing about Peter's confession. So the interesting here is because some disciples were not granted by the Father to come to Jesus, they leave him. So it's interesting that many of his disciples turned back and no longer followed him. So there were people who went to Jesus to be taught, and this author is showing that there can come people who come in and who sit there and listen and engage with Jesus and his teachings, but they're not going to be faithful. They're not going to stay with Jesus. They're not going to be loyal. And the reason why they're not loyal is because the Father has not enabled them to do so. So there's something of a part of an election that seems to be suggested by John's rendering of why certain disciples don't stay, is because the Father has not enabled them to stay with Jesus and be loyal with Jesus. The Jews' reaction to Jesus' words may reflect the reaction of Jews in the author's day, especially to the Christian experience of the communion, because this all follows the section about Jesus describing himself as the bread of life. And so one might wonder if this story about disciples who are leaving may be reflecting certain Jewish Christians who, in the experience of communion and what was being claimed about Jesus during communion or in the uh, community, maybe finding it a bit of a stretch for them or a struggle for them to accept some of these ideas, and so they are leaving. And so this story kind of anticipates that event that may have been occurring at the time of the author. Jesus' question to his disciples is probably used again by the author to prompt faithfulness among his own readers. Do you want to leave too? So when reading the Gospel of John and this issue about disciples deserting Jesus or deserting the community, one needs to keep in mind as well 1 John, because 1 John is also written by the same within the same community, uses the same kind of language. And in 1 John, we do see that there has been a departure that has occurred. So that helps us to see why this author may be reflecting that departure, reflected in 1 John. He may be thinking about that as he's telling this particular story and wanting to see this story as also an explanation of what's happening in his own time. Peter's confession in verse 69 is really interesting. It becomes a model of Christian confession in John's gospel. It's not the same confession that we find in the Synoptic Gospels. There we find that Peter confesses Jesus as the Christ, the Messiah, the Son of the living God. So, but he is the Holy One of God. So not so much Messiah. Which is really interesting because in John's gospel, the author tells us that he wrote this gospel in order that people might believe that Jesus is the Christ. So it's kind of interesting that we don't have the model confession claiming Jesus is the Christ. So you will get later on when we see in John 11 with the raising of Lazarus, another confession by the sister of Lazarus. And so, but here we have this one of Peter calling him the Holy One of God. And finally, Judas's betrayal then becomes symbolic of the betrayal of those Christian Jews who may be returning to the synagogue, or departing, as it were, from the Christian community. So this whole episode here in 66 through 71, is likely to be written with a kind of a consciousness of the departures that are occurring at the time that the author is writing. And we will leave it with that.